family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of TakeThe12.org. That's TakeThe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on TakeThe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 2, and I am just over the moon excited to have my special guest with us tonight, Greg F. Greg, please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg, and I am an alcoholic. It's interesting. Thank you, Rick, for inviting me to have the opportunity here to share my experience, strength, and hope with this stuff. Due to the grace of God that I did not want to believe in, strong sponsorship and the steps in AA. I've been sober since September 23rd, 2011. And for that, I am amazed and grateful at the life that I have today. I grew up in a little town in Southern Illinois with a father who was an alcoholic, and I dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. And the best I ever did, at least initially, was to finally find alcohol. And I was a crazy little kid growing up, and alcohol seemed to soothe that savage beast inside my head. And, I got sober in Alaska, and there was I drank for over 35 years. Let's go with that. I started drinking when I was 15, and I got sober just before my 50th birthday as a result of a head-on collision and a blackout with a police officer. And I ended up in jail, and that was the morning of September 23rd was the last drink that I ever had.
And I'm sorry, it was what year again?
September 2011.
2011, thanks.
Yeah, and I haven't had a drink or anything that affected me from the neck up since that date that wasn't doctor prescribed. And up to that point, it was amazing. And, I have a home group. I have been sponsored, and my sponsor knows that he's my sponsor. I've heard a lot of people say that. I think that's very important to let people know. And I have had the honor and the privilege to sponsor other men in the program. And my life is just magnificent today as a result of this. And I do believe that this step is one of the linchpins of my sobriety. So thank you for letting me speak on this.
I love that. Thank you so very much. And in the interest of total honesty and transparency, Greg and I both share a sponsor. We both have the same sponsor, Chris D. And I've had enough conversations with Greg to know, and been in enough book studies with him to know that the work that we get to do with our sponsors is just enormously invaluable. So and I'm just really grateful to be able to get to walk that same journey with you. So wonderful. All right, let's jump right into it.
Okay.
We're going to be talking about step 2. And so what I want to do first is I want to set it up a little bit. I want to read the step. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And because every one of our legacies have a spiritual principle that it's attached to it, my personal belief is that the spiritual principle of step 2 is hope. And when I have the privilege of being able to take a sponsee through the steps, teach them how to take the steps so that they can go out and teach others how to take the steps, I believe that there's oftentimes we're always looking not for shortcuts, but for that one thing that you need to know about step two. It's kind of like, if you don't remember anything else about step two, remember this. And what I teach is the solution to my problem isn't me. And I don't know if you have any experience on that as well, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about that. So the first question that I want to throw your way is, why did you say yes to speaking on step two?
That's a great question. And, I've thought about that. And the answer comes to me that the fact is that when I finally got to my first AA meeting, I was scared to death and I didn't have a clue.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a man that was at that meeting, and I was in the Salvation Army. I was in a rehab facility, and I had just been transferred from the Anchorage jail to this. It was called a bed-to-bed transfer. And the first meeting I went to that night was a man who had only been sober for 2 weeks, but he'd been in and out of AA. And he said that it was an honor and a privilege for him to be there to share his experience, strength, and hope, and that it was our responsibility to be there anytime that an alcoholic reached out their hand for help. And I know that's part of what our principles are, but I was scared to death. I didn't have a clue. And they read the 9-step promises that night, and it has been ingrained in me. And I firmly believe this now, that it is my duty and my responsibility. My primary purpose is to stay sober and to help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And the way that I do that is by sharing my experience with others.
And there is no way, and my guess is, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no way that that could have happened had you not come to believe in a power greater than yourself.
That's correct. But I will tell you this, it took me a while to get to that point. And step two was not an easy step for me to take. I'm a scientist. I've got a PhD in marine biology, and my life has been ruled by empirical evidence. And it was hard enough for me to admit that I was powerless over alcohol, let alone that my life was unmanageable. Here I was with a 6-figure salary.
Right.
I was running a $50 million contract, and my whole world collapsed around me. And I didn't have a clue. And for my sponsor at the time to tell me that I was powerless and that my life was unmanageable, and then brought back to me that I had to believe in God, that 3-letter word, God, sent shivers up my spine. I was a militant atheist.
Really?
And
all of your life, or
all of my life.
Okay, so you didn't have
now,
like a God connection early on in life.
Correct.
It's always
correct.
been an atheist.
In step two, they talk about, on page 25 in the 12 and 12, they talk about, let's look first at the case of the one who says he won't believe, the belligerent one. That is me. Page 26, 25, 26, and 27 talks about me specifically.
Right.
And the reality, I grew up in a home that my father was an alcoholic. My mother wanted to go to church. I was raised in the Catholic religion. But the Catholic, the nuns were the meanest thing that I'd ever seen. I mean, I got beaten in 2nd grade because I had a problem with Genesis. Right. I said, how did God create the sun 3 days after? On day 3, how did they judge time? And I got beaten with a ruler. That was at a very young age. And I've been fascinated by science, and the idea that there was a power greater than myself was something that was a very, very huge pill for me to swallow.
Right.
And I'll bring in an analogy. How do you eat a whale?
One piece at a time.
Exactly. That's exactly right. One piece at a time, one bite at a time. And my sponsor at the time, that's what he did. He spoon-fed me this step.
Right.
He didn't immediately force me.
So I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about, and I'm really grateful that you brought up the 5 examples of the 5 types of believer
Mhm.
that's in our literature. I remember there have been multiple times where I've had sponsees who said, well, I am this is me. This one example, this one type is me, or this one type is me, or this one type is me. And I'll never forget the first time that I had a sponsee come to me and say, can I be multiples of those?
Mhm. Mhm.
And it was the first time that I'd ever thought that I personally needed to do my own inventory. I needed to look and see where I plugged in. And when I went back and really pulled back the layers of the onion to look at each one of the 5 examples of the 5 types of believers,
Mhm.
I found that there was a little bit of me in all of them. Now, there was one that was more than the rest, but I found myself in all of them. And but you really were just primarily the belligerent one.
I think I was, and I'll relay another story. In 2008, I was running aerial surveys over here on the East Coast off New Jersey, and I had just gotten remarried a second time, and my wife asked me to come home so that we could have a little soiree. Her family wanted to have a party for us, right?
Right.
And I said, okay, but I didn't feel comfortable, and my team called me and said they didn't feel comfortable, and we canceled the survey. Long story short, the company owner said you'll fly it, or you'll get fired.
Right.
The next day, the plane crashed. My best friend was killed in the plane crash. The
Mm.
pilot was killed, and a young lady who was 25 years old, it was her first job, her first marine biologist job, had severe brain damage, and
Mm.
she's still suffering today. And that was a turning point in my drinking in 2008. And at that particular time, I was like, how could there be a God that
Mm.
would allow something like this exist when I did the right thing and I took it all on me? And this is that arrogance, that egomaniac that I didn't realize I was at the time. And I went to her sister, the young lady's sister, and I said, I'm so sorry. That should have been me in
Mm.
that, because that would have been me in the front right seat where she was. And her sister turned to me and she said, Greg, you're not God. It's
Mm.
not your decision as to who, what, when, where dies. God has a plan for you. And at the time, Rick, I did not want to hear that.
Right.
But that strengthened and enforced my belligerence. And it's funny because later on, something very similar would happen. I'd have my car wreck, and I died in that car wreck. They brought me back. Thank God. And I say that now, the police officer didn't die in that car wreck. And it set me on a path to where I am today. And my first sponsor, I always told him that 3-letter word, God, just it caused a serious physical reaction.
Right.
And he said, how about looking at it as a group of drunks? No, it's not going to work. Good orderly direction. Nope, that ain't going to work. He said, you're an arrogant SOB, Greg. He said, how about Greg's own director? And he cracked the door open. He got the
I
door
love
open.
that.
Yeah. And that was the initial start to me trying to open my mind
Right.
a little bit. And here I am, a scientist, and I refuse to open my mind.
Well,
I
I
got
think
another story about that too, but
I think that, and we've heard, good orderly direction, group of drunks
Mhm.
around the rooms for years and years and years. I had the honor of sponsoring an atheist once as well, and I remember he came up with his own definition of the acronym, whatever,
Mhm.
that worked for him, just like your sponsor did with you. But his was gift of desperation.
Yeah,
Because the
I've heard that one.
desperation, right? The desperation that got him to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous over time became a gift to him.
Mhm.
And it
Mhm.
was that gift that kept on giving and giving and giving.
Yeah,
But I had
yeah.
never heard that until I worked with him. And I love that as well. You said you had another story about that?
Well, when you look at that, first of all, when I heard that, all I read in that was I had to believe in a higher power, something that's number one, that's got more power than me, right? Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves. I didn't hear the came. I heard you have to believe
Right.
in God. And oh, by the way, you're insane. And and that was the mental twist that I had. And my I tell you, the very first sponsor, and maybe it was just that I was at such a low place that I was finally willing to listen to anything. But he challenged me. He said, let's use your scientific knowledge. You think you're so great, go design an experiment. Are you willing to believe that I believe?
Right.
Yes.
Which
I believe you believe.
Yeah, I love that.
He said, now go find other people. Pay attention to the people in the rooms who are coming in and out, are constantly raising their hands as newcomers. Talk to them, find out what is it. He said, talk to the people who have time, the people who you see, who you think are fake, that are always acting positive. And he used my intelligence. And immediately I sat out. Okay, I'm going to prove to you that this program doesn't work and that a higher power isn't needed. Now, I'm not saying other people can't stay sober without a higher power. I know there are people. I've met a man
Sure.
that has 35 years of sobriety.
Sure.
And he's an atheist, and he said flat out, but he chooses to behave and to take the steps and do the things as if he did believe.
Right.
But,
well, and Bill was very clear when he said,
mm-hmm.
We don't have the corner on recovery.
Right.
We don't have the corner
Exactly.
on God. We don't have the corner on recovery, but we do
Right.
have a way that works if you work it, right?
Yep, exactly.
I want to go off in a little bit of a different direction. I want to, well, not a little bit of a different direction. I want to kind of hone in on the spiritual principle that I had shared with you a moment ago of hope.
Mm-hmm.
How was there a specific moment in your recovery where the spiritual principle underlying this step came to life for you? I mean, like, you can look back and just like, that it was in this moment that hope was real.
So when it comes to hope, I was hopeless for several years, even though I was sober. I will say that.
Hopeless in the rooms of AA.
In the rooms.
Right.
Now, I was facing 24 years of time behind bars because of what happened. And everyone kept telling me, Greg, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And I was 2 years sober when I went back to prison. When I went to prison, when I remanded for sentencing. And in that 6 months, I became absolutely hopeless.
Right.
I mean, I had absolutely no hope that I was ever my career was gone. I had no one in my life. The only, at least my sister and my brother my son showed up when I was in the hospital, but nobody else reached out to me. I was at a point of being hopeless. When I went for sentencing 6 months later, and this was January of 2014 when I remanded, and then June of 2014 when I went for sentencing, half of the courtroom was filled up with people from the rooms of AA.
Mm-hmm.
And they were there, and they spoke on my behalf. I had a stack of letters of people that said I was demonstrating the principles. I was a changed person.
Right.
Now, that gave me hope. It was quickly, the police officer forgave me. I was able to make my statement that I regretted and that I would do everything in my power to stay sober and help other alcoholics. But when I got sentenced, the judge said he didn't give a care what was going on. But Rick, I was put on a bus that evening between two men who were my age, who had been in prison since they were 18 years old.
Wow.
For murder. And they were still serving an additional 80 years between them for the multiple murders they committed. And those guys picked me up and began to tell me how I would go through the 8 years that I was sentenced. And I had no chance for parole, supposedly, and no chance for early release. That wasn't what I experienced later, but I didn't know that at the time.
So hope in that moment,
Hope, yes,
gone.
it was completely gone until I started talking to those men. And they began to talk me through how you do the time, don't let the time do you. When you get there, immediately volunteer to go work at the farm. Immediately volunteer to go to LSAT, which is a life skills alcohol substance abuse training program. Immediately get yourself a job. These were things that I wasn't able to do during that first 6 months. When I got there, I didn't even have to ask. They immediately told me. And what I began to see, Rick, was little bits of hope begin to show up.
Right.
I didn't equate it to anything more than this is just what happens.
Right.
But as you begin to get a day and day, every day begins to add, you get that additive effect and you get that snowball effect where now you begin to get hopeful and you begin to get comfortable. I started working with other men in the prison. I started going to the farm on a daily basis, working, getting to go out into nature. I also became I finally realized that I'd been having spiritual experiences my entire life.
Right.
That I never even realized what they were.
The man of science having spiritual experiences. I love it.
Yeah, and I didn't anticipate that, but I could play it off, well,
right.
That's just nature, and I'm, but that, that's a long trek to that little tiny glimmer of hope. But it gave me exactly what I needed. And Rick, a year later, I was laying in my bunk out at the farm. I was living at the farm now, and I realized that I was living happy, joyous, and free in a prison,
right.
prison setting.
Right.
And that was hope. And I could only tie it back to that step.
So let me ask you, I think you kind of have sort of answered this, but I want to ask the question flat out. What were the biggest obstacles for you in taking step 2?
Well, I've explained that the fact that I'm an atheist, number one,
right.
and I've got a great way, I told my sponsor, he asked me point blank, do you believe there's a power greater than yourself? And I said, no, I don't. And he goes, oh, really? He goes, okay, well, let's go. I'm going to check you out and let's go to the liquor store and I'll buy you your favorite bottle of scotch. And I said, my favorite bottle of scotch is $150. He said, I don't care. I'm proving a point. I said, I'll let you drink that bottle of scotch. What's going to happen? And then I'll take you back. And I said, no, we can't do that. He goes, why not? I said, because they're going to send me back to prison. He goes, oh, so the Department of Corrections is a power greater than you.
Right.
And he said, do you not see that what you're doing, this concept is an insane act? And it took me a while to get there. And he finally said, Greg, you don't have to immediately believe that if there is a power greater than you. It says came to believe. And that's when he asked me the question, do you believe that I believe?
So what, if anything, did you have to surrender when you took this step? I mean, in the step study that I have on takethe12.org for step 2, in all of the steps I list, because I'm a big believer that in every single one of the steps, there are going to be something that I'm going to have to surrender. And in step 2 on the step study, I actually listed 2 things. And the 2 things that I listed were, I'm going to have to surrender my desire to control everything myself, and then my belief that I'm responsible for the outcome of my life. Right. What did you have to surrender?
At the time, I believed I surrendered everything about who I was. I had to give up. I mean, it's like what we say in the big book, we ceased fighting anything and everything. Right. And at that particular time, I had to just simply surrender and let go of everything. I had to accept the fact that I didn't have a clue about what was going on. And that was hard. Like I said, I was, as we often say, and I know I've heard it a lot, we were arrogant, we were egomaniacs with an inferiority
Right.
complex.
Right.
And that spelled me out. That was who I was. And I had to give up control. I was already giving up control of my life because of being, I knew I was going to go to prison.
Right.
And my sponsor pointed that out. And the idea that I grew up in a very, very troublesome household. Chaos was something I became a professional at managing. And when this happened, it became readily apparent that I was not going to be able to manage my way out of this, that I was going to go to prison no matter what. And I either stopped fighting and just allowed the process to happen and to go and listen to other people and take their advice, or I was going to go nuts, go crazy. And I had already tried to kill myself. That didn't work.
Right.
And, so I think those are two, you hit the nail on the head with that, and I have a happy, joyous, free life that I never thought I'd have as a result of that surrender.
As a result of the surrender. And surrender has been, I know a lot of members of Alcoholics Anonymous that struggle with the idea of surrender, struggle with the idea of letting go, struggle with the idea of admitting that I don't have all the answers, struggle with the idea of understanding that there is another way to live my life other than the way that I've been living it, even though my life is a mess, my life is falling apart. I still, I struggle with the fact that there may be a better way than my way, right? And understanding that I am not the solution to my problem. It was incredibly difficult for me. I want to ask you this. If any, do you think that there are any myths about step 2? I mean, what are some of the things that you hear in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous about step 2 that in your experience just aren't true?
Well, initially, I think I bought into the myths that I told you, Rick, it was 5 years before I finally came to believe, truly believe. And to truly
okay, I'm sorry to interrupt, but were you sponsoring men at that time in those 5 years?
I was, and I was sponsoring, but I wasn't, none of them were sticking around.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Now is that on me? I don't know, maybe, but the fact was, the first time I ever went and I got an AA call, it was an atheist wanting me to explain how I can believe in doing this program. And it was a perfect phone call from the standpoint that it got me to begin to think, how am I going to be able to tell this story? And yeah, I was sponsoring men, and I think 2 of those men are still sober today.
Right.
But I was told one of the biggest myths that I heard, and I still don't believe it, was that there's no way you'll ever stay sober if you don't believe in a higher power.
Right.
If you don't believe in God. And I flat out won't ever tell someone that, because I stayed sober, like I said, over 5 years. Now, was it a sobriety that I have today? Absolutely not.
Right.
But there was what I want to explain to you why I was able to, well, I wasn't able to, but I opened my mind and I went to a spirituality conference, and there were on the board, or on the panel, believe it or not, were 3 astrophysicists on that panel. And, I'll just tell you the story. They began the question that I asked. Well, I don't remember if I asked it or somebody else asked it, but how can an astrophysicist believe, they're some of the smartest scientists that I know. How can you believe in a higher power? And he said, there's in the universe, we know what the planets, the stars, the galaxies, all of that make up 4% of the known universe. And he said that means that 96% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. We believe it's there, but we can't see it. We can't even detect it. But this is what we have been able to use our empirical knowledge and our empirical data to determine. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're telling me 96% of the known universe can't be seen or detected, and you're going on faith? And he said, yes.
Wow.
And that cracked open a door for me bigger than the God acronym.
Absolutely.
And there was another gentleman who's over here on the East Coast, Omar S. And he gave a talk, and he's a medical doctor, and he gave a talk in Alaska that gave the statement, he looked at spiritual experiences like an aha moment or a light bulb being turned on.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that clicked with me. And so the myth, I believe, is that you have to believe in God. And my myth that I went in, and this is my own personal one, was that it had to be a Christian God.
Right.
It had to be the God that I was raised with. It
Right.
took several years of people telling me, you can come up with your own, even though it's in the 12 and 12. I had to come up with and George was great, my first sponsor. And my very first conception of a higher power was just the power of the universe.
Right.
And to this day, I don't know what it is, but I've no longer fight about it. And I think that's the thing that everybody wants to do when they first come in.
No doubt. And I'm grateful that I finally understand today that what I ended up doing when I came into the rooms, because I was raised in the church, and I was raised with a very, very Christian God, very conservative kind of environment. And I'm grateful that while they never used these words, what I ended up doing was unlearning God and relearning God. And I am so incredibly grateful that I did that. Now, that's kind of what I ended up with in this whole idea of creating your own conception, right? I had to unlearn it to relearn it. I want to circle back to something that you were talking about a moment ago about sponsorship. When taking a sponsee through the steps and teaching them how to take this step, is there one specific thing you always want them to know about this step? I mean, like, what's the most important? And you may have already said it, but like, what's the one thing that they need to know about this step?
So one of the things that when I'm working with other men, I'll ask them point blank, do you believe in higher power? Do you believe in God? What is your conception? One of the things that I have them do is to write out a paragraph or two about their concept of a higher power or God. And at that point, if they say, I don't believe, then I'm like, okay, do you believe? And I ask them the same question. Do you believe that I believe? And I want them to understand that this is not an absolute. You don't have to step into this step immediately believing in a higher power.
Right. I love that.
It says came to believe.
I love
because
that.
if they had told me, and again, it wasn't something I was told that I had to believe.
Right.
Later, I was told I wouldn't stay sober if I didn't believe. But it's over time that I believe that what happens is I was introduced to certain things in my life at certain times that began to nudge me one way or the other. Right. I call them significant emotional events. It's something I learned in the military years ago. And
significant emotional event. SEE.
Yes.
SEE.
So, coming home or going out to pass my papers and catching my father cheating on my mother.
Right.
At 5 o'clock in the morning. That was a significant emotional event because it changed my trajectory in the way that I viewed my father.
And you had those C's around God as well, I'm assuming.
As time came on, I had these experiences. I had the opportunity to swim with a humpback whale and have the calf come up and rub against me, and the mother push me up out of the water in the Caribbean. That was a significant emotional event.
Sure.
And it was a spiritual experience. It was later, after finding this, that I began to connect all of the experiences that I've had through life, that either I was being protected or that I was being pushed down a path to become the person that I am becoming today. And I'm
Right.
still evolving.
Right.
And, I'll share with you another quick story that was a linchpin like this step that made me believe now that I am being taken care of. I was coming home from Alaska in 2018 after asking the woman of my dreams to marry me. She said no. And I was crying on an airplane flying from Seattle to DC. And the flight attendant came up to me, and here I am 7 years, a little more than 7 years, almost 8 years sober. And she sets a single malt scotch in front of me and says, "You look like you could use a drink."
Oh,
And I sat there and I immediately stopped crying and I started laughing.
exactly.
And she said, "Why are you laughing?" And I said, "You don't understand.
You just
If I
don't.
drink that drink, we'll never get to DC because I'm going to tear this plane up." And she
That's
said,
for
"Oh, are
sure.
you a friend of Bill's?" And I said, "Yeah." And she immediately removed it.
Oh my
And
God, I love that.
that was an opportunity in my sobriety, as I don't know if it was a test, but I think it was just something, maybe just a way that, my higher power of saying, "Hey, Greg, let me bring you back to reality. This doesn't mean
Exactly.
squat."
Exactly. And it puts an exclamation mark on this idea of my thinking being the real problem, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In fact, I want to take that. That's a little bit of
Mhm.
a little bit of a lead in. I'm going to read an
Sure.
excerpt from the step study on takethe12.org on step 2. And I'd love to, after I read it, I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So it
Sure.
says in step 2, in step 1, we learned our problem wasn't alcohol. It was or is our mental states, our thinking, that was the crux of the real problem. It even says it on the top of page 35 and more about alcoholism, right? So we shall describe some of the mental states that precede a relapse into drinking, for obviously this is the crux of the problem. How perfect is it that just 10 pages later, on page 45 in We Agnostics, Bill shares with us the solution to that problem, where he says this, quote, "Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves." That's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. And I remember thinking, check. All right, how simple is that? I mean, it really, on 35, the Bill identifies what the problem is, my mental states, my thinking.
Mhm.
And then on 45, he tells me what the solution to that problem is, right? So this one of 12 simple suggestions really is much easier than I ever imagined it would be, because I thought solving the drink problem was going to be insurmountable. But when I figured out that it's not the drink problem that I need to solve, but a think problem, and that simply believing that there's a power out there that's greater than I am can help me solve it, that for whatever reason, that just made it all so much easier for me. I mean, even if I struggled with some God baggage coming into the rooms of Alcoholics
Mhm.
Anonymous, which I had, but all of a sudden it just seemed lighter. Does any of that resonate with you?
Oh, I mean, completely. I mean, when you brought that up in one of our step studies a while back, it immediately set off all kinds of alarm bells of why didn't I catch that previously? But the reality is what I've found is that the compulsion, that desire, that craving of alcohol left a long time ago. And I've been grateful that I have not had that back. What I have is a problem of my thinking.
Mhm.
Now, when I drank, the more I drink, the more I think, the more I think, the more I drink. And I started that nasty spiral.
Right.
What I began to find is that, and this is through the grace of God, through all of you, in the rooms of helping me, give me a perspective of what it is that I'm thinking. If I tell you what I'm thinking, I get it out of my head, and then you begin to tell me the reality of what that means. And I'll give you an example of how it's played out for me. In 2017, my sponsor finally said, a new sponsor that I had, he said flat out, Greg, you've got to apply for some other jobs. Apply for this government job. I showed him the government job. And I said, Kelly, there's no way I'm going to get this. And he said, it's not your job to plan the results. Do the work.
Right.
Leave the results to God. I did the job. Long story short, I ended up moving out here to DC from Alaska. Here I am, a convicted felon, and my parole officer tells me, yes, they will make it happen, that I need to get out of here. Even recently, I was talking to Chris, and I was telling him that I don't think I'm going to get this job, this new job, because, they're going to go back and they're going to look that I'm a felon and everything else. He goes, Greg, what am I going to tell you? And I said, you're going to tell me just to do the work, quit thinking, just go do the actions.
That's right.
And sure enough, I've left Alabama, moved back up here, and I'm starting this new job. That is the problem that I have, is my thinker. I've got what I consider a murderer up inside my head.
Oh God.
That when I turn him loose, I can completely ignore every bit of empirical evidence that I have been shown these last 10 years.
Right.
That if I simply take the action, get out of the way, and let the process happen. I trust the process. I believe there's a power greater than myself. I trust the process. I let go of the results.
It's so funny that you mentioned that. One of the things that I have, that one of the gifts that has been given to me within the last, I don't know how many years, 5 to 7 years, I was taught the 3 steps to freedom and enlightened living. The first step is non-resistance. I need to stop fighting it. The second step is non-judgment. I need to stop judging it. I need to stop placing a label of good or bad on everything. And number 3 is non-attachment, that I need to stop attaching an outcome to everything. Those 3 things, non-resistance, non-judgment, and non-attachment, could never, ever, ever possibly be a reality in my life today unless I am believing that there is a power greater than myself out there that has my back, right? There's no way on this earth, which leads me to my last question that I'm going to have for you tonight, which is around the idea of inventory. I believe that inventory is a big word to some, but I believe taking inventory on a regular basis is vital to the maintenance of my spiritual condition, right? And in the step study on Take the 12, and it's the same study I take all my sponsees through, I have them write inventory at the end of every step. At the end of every single step, they're going to write an inventory about how they are practically applying the spiritual principles found in that step in their personal relationships, in their work relationships, with God and AA. So talk to me for a moment about inventory. What does inventory look like in your life today, specifically as it pertains to step 2?
So what I have to do every day is I have to wake up in the morning and just simply say thank you.
Mm.
And I have to be grateful for everything that I have in my life. I say have to, but if I want to live happy, joyous, and free, and that's my purpose, that's what I want. I want to live happy, joyous, and free.
Right.
I need to be grateful for whatever shows up. Rumi, the guest house comes to mind, about accepting all of the things that come in, both good and bad, that may come in and completely wipe us out. But what I try to do, and I shouldn't probably, I guess, use the have to, but the reality is if I don't do that, I'm going to run amok. And
you don't have to, you get to.
Thank you. That's a good way to put it too. And I would have said that to my sponsees as well. I take him, if I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling uneased, depressed, whatever, I immediately ask myself now to today, what's going on? And I'll stop. I use the pause. I put everything on pause and I'm like, okay, let me take a minute. Let me figure out why I'm so irritable. What's going on? And that to me is a rapid assessment of my inventory. What's going on? why am I so stressed out? Why am I anxious? Why was I anxious about this job? It's because I'm lacking trust in my higher power. I
Right.
don't have the and you know, it took me a while to get that faith, to build it up. I saw it in others, but I didn't think it would happen for me. Now that I know that it is happening for me, and I use my experience and my faith and my trust to show the guys that I have the honor of sponsoring. You've seen it happen to me. Now let me show you how it happens in you.
Right.
I always have been having the guys I work with. If you're irritable, why? Do a quick inventory. What is it that you're so mad about? I don't believe in this idea of taking inventory once and never going back and redoing an inventory. I think it's a date for me. It's a daily basis. Every evening, I can't sleep if I've done something.
Well, that's
You
why,
know,
and
it's
that's
a
why we have a
demon.
step 10.
Exactly. But it can apply to this concept of anxiety and depression,
Sure.
which are part of, you know, if you're anxious, you're living in the future. If you're depressed, you're living in the past.
Right.
For us to be able to truly have serenity and peace, we live in the now. And that's, you know, that's, you and I talked about Eckhart Tolle,
Yeah.
um, the power of now, the concept that everything that happens in my life, accept it and let it come through. It's feelings are not reality. And for me, if I don't understand that and I don't take an inventory to assess why I'm restless, irritable, and discontented, for example, I'm not taking action on my character defects. And hope, which you've identified, I also use trust as a spiritual word for this step.
Sure.
Um,
They're so interchangeable. I actually use
I
trust
agree.
as the spiritual principle for step 3 because
Uh-huh.
I can't turn my will in my life over to the care of God unless there's some level of trust there. But you're absolutely correct. I think there is such an interchangeability between trust and hope, and there's a lot of overlap. So I don't disagree with you there.
Well, I honestly, I believe step 2 and step 3 are so interconnected that
Sure.
step 2 and step 3 were things that I didn't really fully address until years later.
Right.
And, but you know, back to the question of an inventory, that's what I do. And that's what I encourage the people that I talk to and I sponsor. And when I gave a talk at a spirituality conference a few years ago, the idea of came to believe is, for me, was the concept. And I related this to the crowd that here I am, I'm Dumbo at the very top of the High Wire Act, right? And I'm looking down at what I believe is a cup of water, and that's belief in God, in a higher power.
Right.
And I'm only going to be able to get to that cup of water by taking a leap of faith. But once I take that leap, my experiences have shown that cup of water expands to the size of the universe. And
Absolutely.
it's like they talk about, you know, stepping through a hoop. That hoop gets as big as you want it to be.
Greg, I could sit here and talk about this all night long, but we are out of time. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on this step? Anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle of this step into practical application in their lives?
I think the one thing is open-mindedness. Frank Zappa said, and mind is like a parachute, only works when it's open,
That's
right?
right. That's
And
right.
coming into this, and I want to read something on page 568 of the big book. This is what my sponsor did to me. He goes, and this is regarding the spirituality, the spiritual principle. You know, we find that no one need have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. And this is what my sponsor hit me over with a sledgehammer. He said, there is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. And that was Herbert Spencer. And that summed it up for me. And
I
open your
love that.
mind.
I
What's
love
the
that.
song? Free your mind and the rest will follow.
And the rest will follow for sure. Greg,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time and for your service. I'm just completely confident that our listeners are going to be able to take a lot away from your sharing. So thank you. Thank you very, very
Thank you,
much. I
Rick.
really
I
appreciate it.
appreciate it. Thank you for allowing me to be of service.
You're welcome. Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this, quote, "We clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function." God bless.